Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to ethics class. This is online class number 10 for Wednesday, April the 8th. I know you all like to have class outside once in a while. This is as close as we could get, right? So we have a virtual outside class. I'm only sitting probably about 1.5 miles from our actual classroom, as the crow flies, that is, in my backyard. You can see a little bit of our backyard here. We have a nice little 3/4 acre backyard here. We're right over behind Panera on Poplar Level. When I was walking out here to set up, the groundhog was running through the yard along with about 4 or 5 or 6 squirrels. I don't know if he was chasing them or they were chasing him. We have a groundhog that's been with us for quite a while, and he goes back and forth between 2 semi-abandoned spots on our property where he makes his home. So a lot of nature. You'll hear some birds, you may hear some sirens. Living, a block away from Audubon Hospital. So at any rate, the topic, unfortunately, is a lot more serious than the pleasantness of being outside. Today we take up the topic of euthanasia. First thing I want you to do, as it says in number 3, contrast the name euthanasia, with the word and the name that we used for happiness when we were considering Aristotle. Euthanasia versus eudaimonia. In each case, the prefix EU means good. In the case of eudaimonia, we saw that eudaimonia, referring to happiness, could also be rendered as a good life, a good spirit, a daimon meaning life or spirit, so a whole life well lived. Euthanasia, on the other hand, takes off on the word thanatos, meaning a good death. Now, I think probably all of us hope for a good death, right? We want to die happily, surrounded by our loved ones, etc. That isn't necessarily what we're going to encounter here in the issue of euthanasia. We're going to see that there are different ways that the term is going to be defined, and oftentimes the definition indicates the conclusion that someone wants us to come to with regard to euthanasia. So, entering here into the last few classes of the whole course, we've got euthanasia, abortion, infanticide, and nowhere else than in these issues is the contrast between our two positions more stark, right? So on the one hand, we have voluntarism, which also has gone by the names of utilitarianism, consequentialism, proportionalism, and so forth. And on the other hand, you have classical realism, which also goes by the ethics of natural law, and Thomism, given our book. Nowhere is the contrast more stark than in these issues. So what we're going to do in the process of considering euthanasia is, in looking at both sides, is make some distinctions, some of which are made by one theory, some of which are made by the other, but all of which are useful in order for us to understand exactly what's going on in this, whatever you call it, procedure or policy or idea of euthanasia. Obviously, this is ethics class, we're dealing with human beings, so we're not talking about the relatively common event of having to euthanize a pet. One of the people that we'll look at does call attention to a possible parallel there, but we're talking about killing human beings in euthanasia. So I don't want that to seem too harsh, but I have to be very blunt. This is what really is under consideration. We've been looking at the issue of killing human beings for a while now. Self-defense, war, capital punishment, but there is a very important distinction between those 3 issues, self-defense, war, and capital punishment, wherein we use the principle of double effect, and issues like abortion and euthanasia. Because in the previous issues, we were looking at combating or dealing with a person who had in some way offended another human being, or who was at least threatening, in the case of self-defense, to offend or do harm to another human being. In the cases of euthanasia and abortion, we are looking at human lives, bringing human lives to an end where no offense is involved, right? So we don't call capital punishment the euthanasia of the murderer. That's not how we refer to it. We refer to it as the penalty of death, all right? And regardless of which side you're on in that particular debate, nobody would ever use the term euthanasia in terms of capital punishment. It's an entirely different range and set of considerations. So I just want to review with you some of the items here that I've pointed out to you in the notes. For example, what's the difference between assisted suicide and euthanasia? And the primary difference between the two is who does it, who does the killing. In the case of assisted suicide, the person who wants to die does the killing. Now, some suicides, I suppose actually most suicides, are unassisted. Somebody just wants to kill himself and he kills himself, right? Assisted suicide, usually encountered more in a medical context, so something has to be set up in order for the person to actually carry out his own suicide. The most famous individual along these lines was the famous Dr. Jack Kevorkian, who invented the so-called suicide machine, where he would get it all set up, excuse me, I forgot my water, where he would get it all set up, and all the person had to do would throw a switch. Now, that is very similar to what's going on in euthanasia. It's just that someone else is throwing the switch, not the person himself. So there are another 2 or 3 distinctions of category which are made with regard to euthanasia. One's called voluntary euthanasia, and that most closely resembles assisted suicide. Just so happens that the person can't really carry out the process himself. Another is referred to non-voluntary euthanasia, and this actually resembles what's happening in cases like abortion and infanticide, where the individual who is being killed is not capable of making a decision. Now I'm going to stop the video and restart in a moment after I get some water.